In northern Kentucky, where salt springs seep up through the ground near the Ohio River, there is a place where the bones start about a foot below the surface. Enormous bones, thigh bones longer than a man is tall, ribs like the timbers of a ship, teeth the size of bricks weighing several pounds each. They lie tangled together in the gray mud of the marsh, thousands of them from animals that no European had ever seen alive. When French soldiers first reached the site in the 1730s, and when traders and surveyors followed over the following decades, they carried the bones back east and across the Atlantic. Those bones ended up on the desks of the most eminent scientists in the world. They were examined in Paris and London. Thomas Jefferson kept a collection of them in the White House, and they created a crisis. Because in the 1700s, the prevailing scientific view held that species did not go extinct, that the natural order was complete and unbroken, and that no animal created by God had simply ceased to exist. These bones did not belong to any known animal, so either an unknown creature was still out there somewhere in the unexplored interior of the continent, or the entire framework was wrong. The scientists of Europe argued about it for decades. Meanwhile, the people who had lived alongside that marsh for generations already had an account of what the bones were. According to traditions recorded from Shawnee, Delaware, and other peoples of the Ohio Valley in the 17 and 1800s, the bones belonged to enormous animals that had once lived in the region, described in some accounts as huge, in some as destructive, and in nearly all as gone. Some versions described how they were destroyed. Some described a single survivor fleeing beyond the Great Lakes or the Western Mountains. And that raises a question that scientists, archaeologists, and folklorists still have not fully resolved. Were those traditions a memory, a genuine account of animals that people had actually seen? Or were they something else entirely today? We're examining the bone beds, the traditions, the dates, and one of the most genuinely difficult questions in the study of oral history. The site is called Big Bone Lick, and to understand it, you have to understand what a lick is. In parts of North America, underground salt deposits push mineral-rich water to the surface through springs. Animals need salt, and so for thousands upon thousands of years, animals came to these springs, first the great Ice Age mammals, and later deer, bison, and elk. They came in enormous numbers, generation after generation. The ground around the springs was churned into soft, boggy mud by their hooves and feet, and some of them didn't leave. Heavy animals got mired in the marsh. Sick and weakened ones came to drink and died there. Over the millennia, the soft ground accumulated an extraordinary density of bones. What was preserved at Big Bone Lick reads like an inventory of Ice Age North America. American mastodons, heavy-bodied, low-slung relatives of elephants with cone-shaped teeth built for browsing on trees and shrubs. Woolly mammoths, larger and grazing on grasses. Giant ground sloths, some of them the size of an ox or larger. Ancient bison with horn spans far exceeding anything alive today. Stag moose, horses, and more. Nearly all of these animals disappeared from North America at the end of the last ice age, in a wave of extinctions concentrated in the period roughly 13 to 11,000 years ago. Mastodons and mammoths in this region appear to have died out toward the end of that window. Precise last appearance dates are debated and continue to be refined, but the broad picture is not in serious dispute. By around 10 to 11,000 years ago, these animals were effectively gone from eastern North America. And here's the crucial fact that makes this whole question possible. People were here. Human beings were living in North America during the final centuries of those animals' existence. Stone tools have been found in association with mammoth and mastodon remains at multiple sites across the continent. Whether human hunting was a primary cause of the extinctions, a contributing factor alongside rapid climate change, or a minor element is one of the longest-running debates in American archaeology, and it is still open. But the overlap itself is established. Humans and mastodons shared this landscape. People saw these animals. People hunted at least some of them. The question is not whether that happened. It is whether anything about it survived in human memory for the 10,000 years that followed. Before we continue, if you enjoyed documentaries that examine forgotten history through archaeology, original records, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps, and it lets me keep making investigations like this one. Because when Europeans began asking about the bones, they got answers, detailed ones. The accounts we have come mostly from the late 1700s and early 1800s, recorded by traders, officials, and naturalists, who were often explicitly asking native people to explain the bones. That framing matters, and we'll come back to it. One of the most widely repeated accounts was recorded in 1762, published in a scientific journal, and attributed to a Shawnee source. It described a time when herds of enormous animals came to the licks and were destroyed. In the version recorded, a great being, angered by the destruction the animals caused, struck them down with lightning until all were killed except one enormous bull, which withstood the blows and then leapt away over the lakes, over the rivers, beyond the mountains. And where he went, nobody knows. Thomas Jefferson himself recorded a version of this account. In his notes on the state of Virginia, published in the 1780s, he related a Delaware tradition along similar lines, describing enormous animals destroyed by a divine agent, with a single survivor escaping to the north or west. Jefferson had a stake in this. He was reluctant to accept extinction, and he seized on the surviving bull element as support for the idea that the animal might still be alive somewhere in the unexplored West. When he sent Lewis and Clark across the continent in 1804, their instructions included attention to any evidence of unknown large animals. He was in a real sense hoping they would find a living mastodon. They did not. Other accounts were collected across the region in the following decades. Traditions describing large, destructive animals in the deep past, sometimes associated with the licks, sometimes with bones found elsewhere. And in a broader sense, traditions describing enormous beings in the ancient landscape are widespread across eastern North America. So, on the face of it, the pattern looks striking. People living near the largest concentration of Ice Age megafauna bones on the continent had traditions about enormous animals that once lived there and are now gone. The temptation is to treat that as a straightforward case of preserved memory, a 10,000-year-old eyewitness account, passed down. And there is a real precedent for oral traditions preserving very old events. Aboriginal Australian traditions describing coastlines that were submerged at the end of the last ice age have been argued in published research to preserve information across roughly that same span of time. Klamath traditions describe a mountain destroying itself in a way that corresponds to the eruption that formed Crater Lake around 7,700 years ago. Oral tradition can carry information across enormous stretches of time that is established. But this specific case has a complication that those examples don't, and any honest treatment has to deal with it head-on. The complication is the bones themselves. At Big Bone Lick, the remains were not buried deep and invisible. They were at the surface or nearly so. They were abundant, obvious, and enormous. Anyone walking through that marsh in any century would have seen them, which means the tradition does not require memory to explain it. It requires only observation. If you find the thigh bone of a mastodon and you know the anatomy of the animals you hunt, and indigenous hunters knew animal anatomy in extraordinary detail, you can determine a great deal from that bone. That it belonged to something huge, that it was a four-legged animal, that the teeth were built for plants rather than meat. You do not need an inherited memory to conclude that enormous animals once lived here and no longer do. You need only the evidence in front of you and the ability to reason from it. This is not a dismissal of the traditions. It is close to the opposite. Reasoning correctly from fossil evidence to extinct megafauna is a genuine intellectual achievement, one that European naturalists, working with the same bones, took decades of argument to arrive at and initially got wrong. Some of the earliest European examinations concluded the mastodon was carnivorous based on its unusual teeth. Indigenous accounts describing large browsing animals were, in that respect, closer to correct. There is also a second complication, and it concerns how the accounts were collected. Nearly every version we have was recorded by a European asking a specific question: what are these bones? That framing shapes the answer. Traditions are told in context, adapted to the audience and the occasion, and a story offered in response to a direct question about a specific bone bed may be assembled differently than it would be told internally. Some accounts pass through interpreters. Some were recorded by people with an agenda. Jefferson's interest in the surviving bull is a clear case of a listener attending closely to the part of the story that suited his argument. And some elements of the recorded traditions are difficult to square with a literal memory reading. Descriptions of destruction by divine lightning, of a single invulnerable survivor leaping over lakes. These are the language of cosmology, not field observation, which does not mean they lack a factual kernel. It means extracting one is not straightforward. So we have three possibilities, and it is worth laying them out clearly. The first, genuine deep memory. Traditions, descending from people who actually saw these animals, transmitted across roughly 10,000 years. Possible in principle, given the Australian and Klamath precedents, but a very long span and hard to demonstrate. The second, inference from evidence. Traditions developed by people reasoning accurately from the bones themselves, incorporated into existing cosmological frameworks. This explains the data with the fewest assumptions. The third, a mixture, a genuine ancient kernel, reinforced and reshaped over millennia by continued encounters with the bones. Under this reading, the physical evidence acted as a kind of anchor, repeatedly renewing and reshaping a tradition that might otherwise have faded. Most scholars who have examined the question carefully lean toward the second or third. And the third is, I think, the most interesting, because it describes something that happens far more often than we acknowledge, traditions that are neither pure memory nor pure invention, but a long conversation between a people and a landscape that keeps handing them evidence. Big Bone Lick is a state park now. The bone beds have been excavated repeatedly since the 1700s, and the site is often described as the birthplace of American vertebrate paleontology, the place where the study of extinct animals in North America effectively began. What came out of that marsh reshaped science. It was central to the arguments that established extinction as a fact, that species can and do vanish permanently. That idea, obvious now, was genuinely radical then, and it was built substantially on bones from a Kentucky salt lick. What we cannot recover is the full shape of what people in the Ohio Valley understood about those animals before Europeans arrived and started asking. The accounts we have are fragments, filtered through translation, through the interests of the men writing them down, and through the specific circumstance of being asked to explain a bone to a stranger. And that is the loss worth naming. Not a lost civilization, not a hidden voyage. Just the ordinary, enormous loss of a body of knowledge that existed, that was rarely recorded on its own terms, and that we now approach through the notes of people who were not really listening. What we can say is this: people lived alongside these animals, that is established. People later encountered their bones in vast quantities in a marsh in Kentucky and drew accurate conclusions about them, that they were enormous, that they were plant eaters, that they were gone. And when Europeans arrived carrying a scientific framework that said extinction was impossible, the indigenous account of the bones was on the central question, correct? The animals had lived, the animals were gone. There was no herd waiting to be found in the western mountains. Jefferson sent an expedition across a continent partly in the hope of finding one alive. He would have done better to accept what he had already been told. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that examine forgotten history through archaeology, original records, and indigenous knowledge, consider subscribing. There are more investigations like this on the way. And before you go, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the traditions about the great animals were memory carried across 10,000 years, or people reasoning brilliantly from the bones in front of them? Or something in between, a story kept alive because the landscape kept reminding them? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.